Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going into a part of the First World War that, well, it often gets lost in the shadows of the Western Front. We're talking about the Winterschlacht, the winter battle in the Carpathian Mountains, a really savage campaign from late 1914 through to April 1915.
And it wasn't just fighting the Russian army. That's the crucial thing here.
Exactly. It was this desperate, almost primal struggle against the mountains themselves, against the snow, the ice, the cold, and it led to, well, just staggering numbers of non-combat deaths.
Yeah, that environmental aspect is absolutely central to understanding this whole thing. This is our mission for this deep dive, really, to get inside the strategic thinking or maybe the strategic desperation of the Austro-Hungarian High Command.
Right.
Why hurl hundreds of thousands of men into this landscape, the High Carpathians in deep winter? A place that military planners already knew was basically unpassable for large armies.
What was driving them to do that?
It was this moment of extreme crisis for the Habsburg Empire. They'd taken huge losses already. Galicia was mostly gone. Russia was pushing hard. We need to unpack the calculus behind this decision and the absolutely brutal costs.
Okay, let's unpack this. So setting the scene, late 1914, you said the dual monarchy was in a precarious position. Just how bad was it? Are we talking near collapse?
Oh, it was incredibly bad.
Yeah.
I mean, the initial war plans, the quick victory they'd hoped for against Serbia and Russia, completely failed. Disaster, really.
Right.
They'd been hammered in Serbia and crucially suffered massive defeats in Galicia against the Russians. Most of that province was lost. The Russian army hadn't just pushed them back, they were deep into the Carpathian passes.
So not just a tactical retreat, this was existential.
Yes, precisely. It was seen as an imminent strategic danger. The Russians were literally at the gates, looking down from the mountains onto the Hungarian plain. The heartland of the empire was threatened.
And it all comes down to that geography, doesn't it? The Carpathians as this last natural barrier. Saving Hungary was the absolute priority.
It was everything. If the Russians broke through those mountains, and they were trying very hard to do just that, they'd pour onto the Hungarian lowlands, that wasn't just losing territory.
No.
For the Habsburg Empire, this incredibly fragile mix of nationalities, losing a core area like Hungary, could have triggered total political disintegration, internal collapse.
Wow.
The whole thing could have just come apart right there in early 1915. And this desperation, well, it forced Germany's hand too. Berlin realized Vienna couldn't hold the Eastern Front alone. They had to step in.
Before we get to the main winter offensive, the Winterschlacht proper, starting in January 15, there was this preliminary battle in December 1914, Limanowa, Lapanow. Was this part of the plan or more of an emergency break?
Definitely an emergency break. A desperate, almost panicked move orchestrated by the Austro-Hungarian chief of the general staff, Conrad von Hötzendorf.
Ah, Conrad. We hear his name a lot in this context. Known for being aggressive.
Aggressive is one word. Obsessed with the offensive, maybe. Sometimes regardless of the cost or conditions. And in early December 1914, he saw the nightmare scenario unfolding. The Russian Southwest Front, under Limanow, was gearing up for a huge push towards Krakow.
Which would have broken them into North Hungary.
Exactly. The very thing they feared most. So Conrad was looking for anything, any weakness he could exploit right now to stop that.
And he found something, a gap in the Russian lines.
He did. A seam about 30 kilometers wide between the Russian Third Army under Dmitry and the 8th under Brusilov, near a town called New Sandes. It was potential vulnerability.
An opportunity for a flank attack.
A risky one, but yes. He ordered Field Marshal Lieutenant Roth's armed group, basically built around the KUK 4th Army, to hit that seam hard.
And this was a big force.
Oh, yeah. The 4th Army alone was nearly 200,000 men, plus some German auxiliary troops. The goal was simple. Smash that Russian salient threatening Hungary. Now.
And incredibly, it actually worked, didn't it? Tactically, at least.
It did. For a moment, it looked like a major Austrian success. The fighting was incredibly fierce, especially around Limanowa itself. There was a crisis around December 10th when Russian reserves came pouring in, but Roth's troops managed to push them back.
How far back?
A significant distance, actually, about 60 kilometers. This forced the Russian Third Army to retreat to a line running through Dunajec, Gorlice, and Tarnow.
So it stopped the immediate Russian threat to Hungary.
Temporarily, yes. It averted that imminent breakthrough. It bought them time.
But that phrase, bought them time, that speaks volumes, doesn't it? The fact they needed such a costly, desperate battle just to push the Russians back 60 kilometers, It shows how weak their position really was.
Exactly. That tactical success highlights the deeper strategic failure. They burned through irreplaceable troops, elite units, just to stabilize the line, just to cling on. General Roth got a title for it, Limanowa, Lapanow, but it was a defensive victory.
Right.
A victory measured in survival, not conquest. And Russia still held most of Galicia. And crucially, they still had that stranglehold on the fortress of Przemyśl.
Which brings us right to the core obsession of the whole winter campaign. Przemyśl. The fate of that single fortress seems to dictate everything that happens next. This leads us into Section 2. The ill-fated Ensatz offensive, the relief attempts.
Przemyśl was absolutely the linchpin. You have to understand, this was one of the biggest fortresses in Europe. And inside, there was this huge garrison of Habsburg soldiers. Numbers vary, but somewhere between 130,000 and 150,000 men.
A massive number of troops just stuck there.
Stuck and besieged by the Russians under General Limanowa. And the reports filtering out were getting worse and worse. Food running out, ammunition critically low, disease starting to spread. The garrison was facing starvation and collapse.
And if 150,000 men surrendered, the strategic impact would be huge, but the psychological blow, devastating for the Austrians.
Oh, absolutely devastating. It would free up Solomon's entire army to join the main Russian force, and it would be this huge symbol to the world, and maybe more importantly to the various peoples within the Habsburg Empire, that the dual monarchy was broken. Its army couldn't even save its own fortresses.
So Conrad felt he had no choice.
Politically, he felt cornered. He decided he had to launch a major broad front offensive, not just to relieve Przemyśl, but to try and push the Russians out of Galicia altogether.
Even though it was now deep winter. January, in the Carpathians.
Even though that decision. It's hard not to see it as fundamentally flawed from the start, launching a huge offensive across mountain ranges in the dead of winter.
Was there any military logic to it at all, or was it purely driven by the political need to do something?
I think the political imperative completely swamped military common sense. I mean, reports from officers on the ground, even before the offensive, described the terrain as unsuitable, the logistics as unpassable.
Unpassable.
Peaks up to 2,000 meters, deep snow, extreme cold, virtually no roads or railways, assaulting uphill into that. It was madness. But the need to save Przemyśl and perhaps Conrad's own desire to prove the KUK army could still act decisively and independently, well, it overruled everything else.
And the fact they needed German help even to attempt it just underlines the weakness, doesn't it?
Completely. They were already reliant on their ally. The Germans knew that if the Austro-Hungarian front collapsed, the pressure on their eastern front would become unbearable. So Berlin agreed to send help.
What kind of help are we talking about?
Significant help. They formed the Deutsche Südarmee, the German Southern Army. This included the 2nd Army Corps under General Alexander von Linsingen, about 23,000 men, including elite German Guard units, highly trained, well-equipped troops.
And where were they placed?
They were slotted into the eastern part of the front. Their job was crucial. Anchor the right flank of the main Austro-Hungarian attacking force, the KUK Third Army, and provide some solidity to the whole enterprise.
So the first assault kicks off January 23rd, 1915. The KUK Third Army, under General Borovitch, leads the charge. What were the conditions like at the start?
Horrific. The sources describe stormy winter weather, blizzards, deep snow, freezing winds, and the casualties started mounting almost immediately, even before major contact with the enemy.
Just from the conditions?
Largely, yes. Frostbite, exposure, exhaustion. The main thrust towards Przemyśl itself, designated Group Krautwald, tried to push through the mountains via Lisko and Sinok. They were stopped dead in their tracks, immediately. They ran straight into well-prepared, deeply entrenched Russian defenses, the veteran 8th and 7th Corps. It was like hitting a brick wall, but a frozen uphill brick wall defended by machine guns.
So right from day one, you see the flaws in the plan laid bare. Were there any successes at all in that first phase? Anything to offer a glimmer of hope?
Very, very little, and mostly where the Germans were involved. The German Sud Army did manage a strong local push near a place called Tukla. That actually helped ease some pressure on the struggling KUK Third Army's flank.
Okay.
And further east, a separate Austro-Hungarian force, Arma Group Flensburg-Bolton, had some success in the Bukowina region. They actually retook the city of Czernowitz by mid-February.
But strategically, in terms of the main goal, relieving Przemyśl, these were just sideshows.
Pretty much irrelevant, yes.
Yeah.
Nice local victories. But they didn't change the fundamental picture. The main offensive towards the fortress was stalled, bleeding men at an alarming rate.
And the numbers from that first month? They're brutal. The sources say by the end of January, Austro-Hungarian forces lost 94,500 men.
94,500, yes. But here's the truly horrifying part of that statistic.
Go on.
Of those nearly 95,000 casualties, over 61,000, almost two-thirds were listed as sick or wounded. Not killed or wounded in combat, but taken out by sickness, frostbite, exposure.
61,000 in 1 month.
That massive imbalance tells you everything. This wasn't just a tough battle. It was an environmental and logistical catastrophe unfolding. Which brings us directly to the defining element of this campaign.
Section 3. The White Hell. It really sounds like the landscape, the weather itself, became the primary enemy, more deadly than the Russians.
In many ways, yes. Far more deadly for the Austro-Hungarians, certainly. You have the Carpathian mountains, rugged high peaks. And this was a particularly harsh winter. Sustained, deep freeze temperatures, often well below minus 20 Celsius.
Minus 20.
Massive snowdrifts, sometimes waist deep or even chest deep. Ice everywhere. Avalanches were a constant threat. And this terrain naturally favored the defenders. The Russians were dug in. The Austrians and Germans were attacking uphill, constantly exposed.
And you mentioned the logistical failure earlier. How badly did the Austrian general staff under Conrad drop the ball on preparing the troops for this?
It was a catastrophic failure, almost criminal negligence, you could argue, driven by this offensive obsession and a total underestimation of winter mountain warfare. The soldiers, especially in the KUK 2nd and 3rd Armies, were simply not equipped.
No winter gear.
Inadequate. Thin uniforms, poor quality boots that froze and fell apart, not enough rations, certainly not the high-calorie food needed for that kind of exertion in the cold. Many lacked even basic training for fighting in snow or preventing frostbite.
And the supply lines needed to get even basic stuff to them.
Collapsed. Almost instantly. This wasn't Flanders with established rail networks. This was a remote, sparsely populated mountain region. The few roads that existed became impassable snow tracks.
So supplies couldn't get in.
And wounded couldn't get out. Trains froze on the tracks. Horse-drawn wagons got stuck. Wounded men were often just left where they fell, freezing to death because evacuation was impossible. The whole system just broke down. Horses froze standing up. It is a nightmare.
So the cold literally killed more soldiers than Russian bullets did. We have some specific data on this, don't we, from the 2nd KUK Army?
Yes, and this data is just devastating. It crystallizes the tragedy. By mid-March 1915, the KUK 2nd Army, which started with about 95,000 men, reported total losses of 40,000.
40,000 out of 95,000, almost half the army.
But look how they were lost. Pay attention to this breakdown. Of those 40,000 losses, how many do you think were killed in battle?
Given what you said, maybe 10,000? 15?
6,000. Only 6,000 were listed as killed by enemy action.
6,000. So, wait, where did the other 34,000 go?
Erkrankung and Kälte, sickness and cold. 34,000 men died from exposure, frostbite leading to gangrene, typhus, cholera, pneumonia diseases that ran rampant in the freezing, unhygienic conditions.
That's almost 6 men freezing or dying of disease for every 1 man killed by the Russians.
Exactly. That ratio tells the story. Entire units effectively ceased to exist without ever fighting a major battle. They just melted away on the frozen mountainsides, on the march, in snow-drifted bivouacs. Men were found frozen solid in groups.
It's hard to even imagine the suffering, tearing clothes off the dead just to survive.
Yes, sources mention that. Eating frozen horse carcasses found in the snow.
Yeah.
The field hospitals, if you could even reach one, were overwhelmed, primitive. Amputations for frostbite were common, often done in appalling conditions. It was just mass misery on an industrial scale.
Meanwhile, the Russians, they were defending, but they employed this tactic the Austrians and Germans found shocking, this Carpathian tactic. What exactly was that?
Well, first, let's be clear. The Russians suffered horrendously, too. Their estimated losses are around 250,000 in this same period. But their tactical approach, particularly on the offensive, was different.
How so?
The Carpathian tactic, as the Austro-Germans called it, was essentially a reliance on mass infantry assaults. Continuous waves of soldiers sent forward, often uphill, directly into machine gun fire, with seemingly little regard for the casualties incurred.
Human wave tactics, basically.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It seemed shocking to the Central Powers officers whose doctrine, grim as it was, still theoretically aimed to use firepower and maneuver to minimize their own losses. The Russian command appeared willing to expend manpower almost endlessly.
Just grinding the enemy down through sheer numbers and attrition.
Exactly. Keep constant pressure, absorb horrific losses, but wear down the enemy physically and psychologically. And it worked. To an extent. It certainly contributed to the massive Austrian losses and the sense of hopelessness.
So you've got Austrian soldiers freezing to death in droves, and when they do fight, They face an enemy willing to sacrifice thousands to hold a position. A frozen meat grinder doesn't even begin to cover it.
It really doesn't. And despite this absolute horror, despite the clear failure of the January offensive, Conrad wasn't done. The pressure to save Przemyśl was still immense. So they decided to try again.
They doubled down. Even after losing nearly 100,000 men in a month, mostly to the cold.
They doubled down. They scraped together reinforcements, pulling experienced corps from other fronts, even from the Serbian front, where they'd recently had some success. Units like the KUK 3rd and 8th Corps.
So battle-hardened troops, but thrown immediately from one brutal fight into this white hell. Yeah. What happened with these 2nd and 3rd relief attempts?
They failed just as badly as the first, maybe even faster. The second main push was launched in late February, running into mid-March. This time it was spearheaded by the KUK 2nd Army under General Barmali.
Same result.
Same result. They tried to force the passes, but the Russian 11th Army, now reinforced and consolidated under Lapanow, the besieger of Przemyśl, held firm. The Austrian troops, likely exhausted and demoralized before they even started, hit what the reports called an iron halt. An iron halt. Sounds final. It was. The attack stalled almost immediately, around February 28th, along a line from Wetlina to Konieczna. Russian counterattacks, using that same relentless pressure, just ground the offensive to a complete stop by mid-March.
Was there a third attempt after that?
A final, brief, almost purely desperate lunge by the KUK Corps around March 20th. It achieved nothing, failed instantly. It was clear Przemyśl was lost.
And the fortress finally surrendered just 2 days later, March 22nd, 1915, starved out.
Starved into submission, yes.
So connecting this back to the bigger picture, the fall of Przemyśl marks the definitive, undeniable strategic failure of the entire Winterschlacht. 3 months of unimaginable suffering and loss, all for nothing.
Absolutely for nothing, in terms of the main objective. And the human cost inside the fortress adds another layer to the tragedy. When the Russians marched in, they captured 117,000 men.
117,000 prisoners of war. A huge number.
Huge. But get this. Only about 44,000 of them were still considered fit for combat. The rest were either wounded or significantly, gravely ill. Around 28,000 were suffering from rampant epidemics, typhus, cholera, dysentery that had swept through the starving garrison. Seuchen, the records call it. Plagues.
Just horrific. So offensive failed, fortress lost, army decimated. Did the Russians then finally achieve that breakthrough into Hungary that this whole nightmare was supposed to prevent?
It certainly tried. With the Przemyśl captured, they freed up forces and immediately increased the pressure, especially against the already battered KUK 2nd Army. They pushed hard.
But they didn't break through.
Ultimately, no. The front did eventually stabilize in April. But how it stabilized tells the final story of Austrian independence. It required the intervention of more German troops. A new formation, the Besieged, the ex-8th Reserve Corps, had to be brought in.
Germans plugging the gap again.
Germans plugging the gap. They helped push the Russians back from the Lebertsadel Valley in early April. By the end of April 1915, the major fighting in the Carpathians largely died down. The Winterschlacht was over. But the Austro-Hungarian army was effectively broken.
Which brings us to our final section, the aftermath and the fatal weakening of an empire. Let's try and sum up the total cost of this 4-month catastrophe.
The numbers are almost too large to grasp. Across the entire campaign, from Limanowa in December 14 through April 15, the combined Austro-Hungarian and Russian losses are estimated at over 500,000 men. Some estimates go much higher, closer to 1 million total casualties, if you include all sickness and prisoners.
500,000 to 1 million in one relatively small sector of the war.
Yes. For Austria-Hungary alone, the direct losses killed, wounded, missing in the Carpathians campaign itself were nearly 250,000. And remember, that figure usually doesn't include the 88,000 officially evacuated sick and wounded who often died later, nor the 117,000 captured at Przemyśl.
So we are talking about a loss to the Austro-Hungarian fighting strength, approaching 500,000 men from this one winter disaster.
In essence, yes. A catastrophic hemorrhaging of manpower. And for what?
Strategically, nothing gained.
Nothing. The goal of relieving Prussia, total failure. The goal of pushing Russia out of Galicia, total failure. It was an unmitigated strategic disaster, purchased at a ruinous human cost.
And beyond the sheer numbers, you argue that who was lost in the Carpathians had a profound long-term impact on the Austro-Hungarian army's ability to fight for the rest of the war.
This is absolutely crucial. It's about the quality of the manpower lost, not just the quantity. When the war started, the core of the KUK army, The most loyal, best trained, most motivated units, especially the professional NCOs and the officer corps, were disproportionately drawn from the German, Austrian, and Hungarian populations.
The traditional pillars of the monarchy.
Exactly. And these were the units thrown relentlessly into the Carpathian meat grinder. They bore the brunt of the fighting and, crucially, the brunt of the deaths from cold and disease. That irreplaceable core of the army was effectively wiped out, frozen to death, or bled dry in the snows of 1915.
Why was losing those specific groups so much more damaging than losing, say, conscripts from other parts of the empire?
Because they provided the cohesion, the experience, the linguistic unity, German being the command language, and the institutional loyalty that held the multi-ethnic army together. As these core units vanished, they had to be replaced by hurriedly trained conscripts from all corners of the empire: Czechs, Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, Croats, Slovaks, Italians.
Often with language barriers, less training, maybe less commitment to the Habsburg cause.
All of the above. The army became increasingly fragmented, communication broke down, morale suffered. The combat effectiveness, the sheer fighting spirit of the KUK army never truly recovered from the demographic catastrophe of the Carpathians. You see the consequences right through to the final collapses on the Italian front in 1917 and 1918.
So the Winterschlacht wasn't just a defeat. It was a wound that festered and ultimately helped kill the patient.
A very apt analogy. It also marked a turning point in the relationship with Germany. This campaign was one of the last major operations the KUK army tried to lead independently, the South Tyrol offensive in 1916, being perhaps the only other significant example.
And its failure cemented Austria-Hungary's status as the junior partner.
Completely. It was undeniable now. Vienna was dependent on Berlin, not just for reinforcements, but increasingly for strategic direction. The failure was so blatant it even had external repercussions.
How so?
Well, Italy had been sitting on the fence. Seeing the Austro-Hungarian army perform so poorly, suffering such immense losses in the Carpathians, it emboldened Rome. They saw weakness. In April 1915, as the Carpathian campaign was sputtering out, Italy was finalizing its secret Treaty of London, preparing to jump into the war against the Central Powers.
So the disaster in the mountains directly encouraged Italy to join the Entente.
It certainly contributed to their calculation. They saw an opportunity to grab Austrian territory, while the Habsburgs were clearly reeling.
And the final proof of this shift in power came just weeks later, in May 1915, with the Gorlice-Tarnow offensive.
Absolutely. That offensive was the response to the Carpathian disaster. It was designed to finally break the Russian front in Galicia and relieve the pressure. But who planned it and led it?
The Germans.
Entirely. It was conceived and executed by the German High Command, led by General Mackensen, commanding a combined German-Austrian force designated as the German 11th Army. The Austro-Hungarian unit played a vital role, but the strategic brain and the driving force were German. Berlin was now running the show on the Eastern Front.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this? If we boil down the long-term impact, the Carpathians campaign seems like this colossal, self-inflicted wound.
It really does. Let's be fair, they achieved one thing. That initial desperate fight at Limanowa did prevent the Russians from breaking into Hungary in late 1914. They plugged that immediate gap.
Okay.
But the cost of plugging that gap and the subsequent attempt to reverse the situation in the Winterschlacht was the destruction of the Austro-Hungarian army's offensive capability for the rest of the war. They saved Hungary in 1914 by sacrificing the army they needed to survive 1916, 17, and 18.
They won the battle for time but lost the war of attrition against both the enemy and the elements. The resources, the men, the morale bled away in those mountains. It was a fatal drain.
It set the stage for the empire's eventual collapse.
Which leaves us with a final thought to ponder. This campaign, so often buried in footnotes compared to Verdun or the Somme, was arguably the moment the Austro-Hungarian Empire's fate was sealed. Not by a decisive battlefield defeat in the traditional sense, but by the slow, grinding, freezing death in the mountains. They achieved their immediate goal, preventing collapse in 14, but the price was the very essence of their military strength. The men who froze in the snow weren't just casualties. They were the backbone of an empire that couldn't afford to lose them.
That's right. The demographic hole punched by frostbite and typhus in the Carpathians in 1915 echoed all the way to the Piave River in 1918. The seeds of dissolution were sown in that white hell. The empire bled out, slowly, fatally, in those snow-covered peaks.
We've explored the strategic desperation, the catastrophic logistical failures, and the truly horrific human cost of fighting nature as much as the enemy, a campaign that swallowed up 500,000 lives or more.
And it's crucial we remember this scale, this forgotten front. The Winterschlacht was one of World War I's most brutal campaigns. fatally weakening an empire already on shaky ground, yet it remains largely unknown. A true graveyard of soldiers and perhaps of an empire.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the white hell of the Carpathian winter. We'll see you next time.